The United States brought the world's #1 terrorist leader to justice. Abu Bukr Al-Baghdadi is dead.
It's Wednesday, October 30th. I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. And this is Ground Game. The world's most wanted terror leader is dead. Abu Bukr Al-Baghdadi, who led the Islamic State group, killed himself during a U.S. military raid in Syria over the weekend.
Baghdadi's demise demonstrates America's relentless pursuit of terrorist leaders and our commitment to the enduring and total defeat of ISIS and other terrorist organizations.
President Donald Trump, who authorized the mission, declares victory. A much-needed win for Trump as he stares down the prospect of impeachment.
This is a moment where we should all be proud of our American military and our intelligence community. This is a moment where President Trump's worst critic should say, "Well done, Mr. President."
But the raid comes with an asterisk. Did Baghdadi die because of Trump or in spite of him? Then we're on the ground in South Carolina, a crucial early state in the Democratic presidential primary.
This is a marathon. I'd be... Even if I knew I was going to win every other state, and the Lord came down and told me that, I'd still be in South Carolina.
It's likely to be a make-or-break state for former Vice President Joe Biden, who is counting on strong support from black voters in the southern battleground to propel him toward the nomination. We hear from Biden and AP's top political reporter in the state. On Sunday morning, President Trump announced the death of Abu Bukr Al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State, the group responsible for the deaths of several American hostages, including the journalist James Foley and aid worker Kayla Mueller. President Trump announced Baghdadi's death from the White House, describing the raid in extraordinary detail.
He died after running into a dead-end tunnel, whimpering and crying and screaming all the way.
Here to help break down what Baghdadi's death means for the Islamic State and security in the Middle East is AP national security writer Robert Burns. Bob, thanks so much for being with us.
Happy to be here, Julie.
So let's start from the beginning here. How significant is Baghdadi's death? What does this really mean?
Well, from the point of view of the Islamic State, it's certainly a blow. There's no question about that. And having lost not just their current leader, but their founder had great symbolic value. And that leaves open the question of who will they choose as successor and how effective would that person be. And the other thing to add on there is that this is really follows on the heels of them having lost what they considered to be the prize feature of their organization, which was the fact that they had physical territory that they controlled and administered in both Syria and Iraq for several years, but had steadily lost that territory and have now lost all of it. And so having also lost their founder and key leader, it certainly is a setback for them.
So this was a group that was already on the run, essentially, having been pushed back from this territory, as you mentioned, that they had taken. The goal of the Islamic State was to really form a caliphate in the region. Talk about the symbolism of these leaders of these terrorist organizations. What kind of presence do they have? What is their purpose, essentially? They're obviously people who are often on the run themselves, often trying to avoid capture or raids like we just saw. But what is their symbolic value?
I think that's a good point about it being a symbolic value to a large extent. In this particular case with al-Baghdadi, he was so long on the run constantly and knowing he was being hunted that the extent to which he actually commanded forces or had a direct leadership role is open to question. But what is certain is that he was a charismatic figure who was known internationally and certainly was an important, if not the most important, recruiting tool for this group, not just in the Middle East, but in the United States as well. People would know that name and would pledge allegiance or at least want to be a known affiliate with that group because of him.
And Bob, you and I have covered this story of the Islamic State together for quite some time. I remember those early days when we were first learning about this group, when you had the really horrific beheadings of James Foley, Kayla Mueller, and others. Can you describe how much concern there was in the early days at the Pentagon, where you spend a lot of your days, about this group, and just how much has changed over the last few years in terms of their strength and their ability to carry out some of these terrorist attacks?
I mean, it's really quite a story if you stop and think about it for a few minutes, because in 2014, when Barack Obama was president, he was told by his military leaders that, by the way, there's this group and they have amazingly swept in across the border from Syria into Iraq and literally taken over huge amounts of Iraqi territory. I mean, they were not just a terrorist group, they were an army. I mean, they had tanks, they had armor, they had the makings of formidable force.
I remember at one point we were even talking about them moving on Baghdad as a possibility.
That's right. I mean, there was a lot of concern because they seemed almost unstoppable for a while. They swept through northern and western Iraq, and indeed there was talk at one time that they could be knocking on the door of Baghdad, and that's when the Obama administration finally decided they better start sending some people back to Iraq to see what they could do to cobble together with the Iraqi forces to stop this. And it took quite a while just to begin to reverse the tide, let alone stop them. But just to begin it was quite an undertaking that took certainly more than a year.
And the timing of Baghdadi's death is so interesting, given what we have just been through with President Trump's decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria and this border region. And one of the things he has said is that we need to get out of endless wars. He says the Islamic State is defeated. He says that the U.S. can safely leave this area of the world. Certainly, he is trying to use Baghdadi's death as another example of the Islamic State's defeat. What is the reality? What do you hear from the Pentagon about the security situation in this part of the world, the prospect of the Islamic State coming back? And what do Pentagon officials say about what the U.S. military's posture in this region should be?
Mm-hmm. I think the Pentagon officials today feel much as they did before President Trump took office, which is that the military dimension of this whole campaign to eliminate Islamic State and similar groups is only one part of it. And if you do what they managed to do, which is to essentially defeat the Islamic State army and to eliminate their physical control of territory in both Syria and Iraq, there still is the underlying problem of what gives the group staying power and why does it resonate with certain elements of the population in both Iraq and Syria, and by the way, a number of other countries, even outside the Middle East. So the answer is that there needs to be, in the view of many people at the Pentagon as well as other parts of the government, there needs to be a long-term sustained effort to not only provide locally effective security, but also some form of governance that can turn people away from this sort of an organization.
I think that's such an important point, Bob, because one of the things that I think people might forget about this is the Islamic State, in some ways, was an outgrowth of al-Qaeda. So we're talking about an ideology that persists even if one group and one leader is defeated, right?
Right. It does persist. I don't think there's anybody who argues differently. I mean, certainly people who don't have a political stake in this in Washington say that that's the case, and it seems rather obvious.
Of course, we do live in a political space, though. Give me a sense of what the dynamic is right now between the Pentagon and the White House over this question of what does happen just tactically on the ground. President Trump has been talking about bringing troops home, ending endless wars. And yet when we hear from the Pentagon, we hear a lot of discussion about troops essentially moving around the region, being repurposed. What does this dynamic look like right now?
Well, one of the elements of that, what you just described, is this question about, quote unquote, securing the oil in Syria. And one might argue that that mission arose as a way of persuading President Trump that the work is really not done, and that you need to keep a troop presence in that part of Syria, whether it's for oil security or the other aspects of the military mission, including working with the Syrian Kurds, and problem we haven't yet talked about, which is a longer term problem, which is the detainees, not just the ISIS fighters who are in prison, but the tens of thousands of followers and family members who also are detained, but only by kind of a thread.
It really is an incredibly complex situation. Bob, you mentioned the oil. The oil is one of the things President Trump brought up a few times in his remarks on Sunday morning where he announced Baghdadi's death. It was really an extraordinary statement turned press conference by the president where he revealed an extraordinary amount of detail about the raid. Obviously, in the aftermath of the bin Laden killing, there were officials who released details about what happened on the ground in Pakistan, but we rarely hear the president of the United States talk about operational details in that way. What stood out to you, Bob, as you heard the president going through this 45-minute statement and question and answer session?
Well, one thing that immediately jumped out at me was when he described the actual entry and exit of the U.S. forces who went to the compound where Baghdadi was found. He said that they took the exact same route in and out, which is the kind of thing that makes any military officer really kind of grimace. That this is called tactics, techniques, and procedures that are practiced but are not supposed to be known to other people as to how they do these sort of things. They might have to adjust and change now.
And of course, the other detail that we learned was about this dog. The dog has become one of the heroes of this operation. What do we know about the dog, and what are we still trying to find out? What is still classified about the dog?
Well, I guess the main thing we found out is that his injury was, or her, I'm not sure whether it's a he or a she, frankly. I think there's been some confusion even about that. But that the injury was rather slight and that the dog is back at work. So that's the good news. The classified part of it is strange, if not comical, that the argument is that the name of the dog cannot be released because that could in some way give away information about which unit the dog works for. And I'm not quite sure how that works, but that's the current argument.
I can tell our listeners that there is high interest in the AP Washington Bureau about this dog, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw the dog making a visit to the White House in the near future.
Bob
Bob Burns, AP's national security writer. Bob, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
When we come back, we head to South Carolina. Can the Southern primary state put Joe Biden on the path to the Democratic nomination?
Hi, I'm Shelley Palmer.
And I'm Ross Martin.
And we're hosting a new show called Think About This.
I didn't know that until about 30 seconds ago, that 5G is not going to make my phone calls faster and my video better.
Is your digital life overwhelming you? Let Shelley and Ross help you survive the disruption.
I cannot be the only one that doesn't know that.
Listen and subscribe to Think About This with Shelley Palmer and Ross Martin from the Westwood One Podcast Network, where the conversation starts.
I didn't get involved in deciding to run because of polling or a particular strategy. I got involved to run because I thought it was so critical that we defeat a man who is absolutely ripping this country apart.
Joe Biden has led most national Democratic primary polls for months. But we don't pick nominees through national elections. We go state by state. And the polls in the opening primary states have looked a bit shakier for Biden, except in South Carolina. Biden has deep ties to the state, particularly in the AfricanAmerican community, and he's been leading polls there by significant margins. Biden sat down with the AP on the ground in South Carolina over the weekend. I'm joined by Meg Kinnard, AP's political reporter in South Carolina, who interviewed the former vice president. Thanks for being with us, Meg.
Thanks for having me, Julie. Appreciate it.
So this was a really fascinating interview with the vice president. Before we dive into some of the details, just give me a sense of Biden's strengths and weaknesses in South Carolina right now.
Of all of the early states, South Carolina is the one where Joe Biden, coming into this, aside from being vice president, was probably the best known. He has had decades-long relationships here, going back to his earliest days in the U.S. Senate. One of the stories he tells frequently on the trail is how Fritz Hollings and his wife, Pete played integral roles in persuading Biden to not only enter the Senate initially after the tragic loss of his wife and daughter, but to stay in the body very early on in his political career. So he has been coming here for decades. He has gotten to know the people here for decades, and people have gotten to know him. So as he has, through the years, campaigned for office, for president before, as part of the Obama-Biden ticket in 2008, he has continued to remind South Carolina, frankly, that he's not new here. He's not someone who's really trying to, for the very first time, let them know who he is. He's been coming here. He's vacationed here with his family for a long time. So on the ground, those perhaps interested voters who are getting out to see Vice President Biden give these political speeches and appear at events, sometimes it feels like there's already a sense of familiarity, not just because he's held national office before, but because he's been here in South Carolina before, and they may have even had a chance to get to know him during one of those previous trips.
And that is a familiarity you really can't replicate during the course of one campaign, right? No matter how many times Kamala Harris or Cory Booker or Elizabeth Warren go to South Carolina in the next 3 or 4 months, they can't make up for Joe Biden's decades-long relationship, right?
It's really something that you can't manufacture in the course of even the 12 months where we've already been seeing some of those candidates here. Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Bernie Sanders, too, have been coming here pretty consistently over the course of the last 12 months. Bernie Sanders aside, clearly because he's run before, all of the other candidates in the race really are trying to get to know people and to have them get to know them. And that's not something that they can really truly make up for in the sense that Joe Biden already has that well-known established persona. A lot of the voters I talk to when I get out on the ground and I say, well, you're here at a Biden event. Are you all in for him? Many of them are, and they were waiting. They were the people who had fallen into the category of there's this long, drawn-out buildup leading to a potential Biden candidacy, and they were just waiting for it to become official. But many of the people that I speak to say, yeah, I actually saw him when he was here on XYZ date, when he came down for this person's funeral. I remember that. I remember this speech that he came and gave at this institution many years ago. So, yeah, that is a familiarity and a real sense of getting to know a person as a candidate, but also just as an individual that Joe Biden really kind of has cornered the market on here.
And one of the reasons why South Carolina is so important in this primary process is, we come out of Iowa, we come out of New Hampshire, 2 states that, frankly, are pretty white. They don't look a lot like America. You go to South Carolina, where the African-American community in the Democratic primary in particular is so powerful. And if you can show strength there, it really sets a candidate up well for the states to come. We saw that happen with Hillary Clinton, certainly in the 2016 Democratic Party, where she really blew Bernie Sanders out of the water in South Carolina. Is that Biden's strategy to basically look to South Carolina to propel him toward the nomination?
That's something I asked the vice president about pretty directly this past Saturday. And essentially the answer is yes. He acknowledges that he is, quote unquote, playing to win in those other early states. But he, to his mind and to the minds of the leaders of his campaign, Greg Schultz in particular, I asked him the same question this past week, his campaign manager, and they are all noting that there is that strength here in South Carolina. And I don't think they like to use the word firewall. I think that's kind of become a buzzy word that we all tend to talk about in terms of, okay, well, this is a state that I think I'll do well in, and then those victories will propel me other places. But that's something that Joe Biden said specifically about South Carolina. He used the word catapult, but he said that regardless of his status coming out of Iowa, coming out of New Hampshire, when he comes into South Carolina, he does believe that he will perform strongly enough here then to lead into victories or strong finishes, at least in those other states that quickly follow. And that is important because South Carolina's Democratic primary electorate is mostly African American. It's the first state where that is the case. And given the strengths that Joe Biden has here already, not just in polling numbers, because those do fluctuate, but in those decades-long relationships, friendships, in really the situation that he has tried to create for himself here over the course of decades, that is what he's looking toward in terms of not just sealing up victory, but really kind of getting the momentum started as he heads into Super Tuesday and all the states that will come thereafter.
So the argument, of course, from some of Biden's rivals is that if they have strong showings in Iowa and New Hampshire, it will give them momentum going into South Carolina. I talked to a lot of people who go back to the 2008 Democratic primary where Barack Obama really, his victory in Iowa made voters in South Carolina take notice. Do you think, though, Meg, that was because voters in South Carolina were looking to see what the early states did generally, or because they wanted to see if voters would side with the first prominent African-American candidate?
I think the second piece of your question hits directly on the mark. So many voters that I talk to, and I feel that you probably are in the same boat, a lot of times they say, well, this state is different, right? I'm not going to vote just based on what people in another state did because this state has different goals and different things are important here. But in that cycle, that was the first time that there really had been the significant focus on an African-American candidate. And in states like South Carolina, where most of that Democratic primary electorate is African-American, there was kind of a holding your breath moment to see, what is this going to be like? Because I remember the days leading up to the primary here, and then particularly the general election as well. There was a lot of apprehension and a lot of, well, is this really too good to be true for a lot of the African-American voters that I talked to? Is this something that we're really getting our hopes up for, but these other states are going to dash it down? But when Barack Obama did have those strong marks coming into South Carolina, that did send a message that, perhaps this will be a place where this can kind of create that momentum, given the strong finishes in other places where most of the voters weren't African-American.
We obviously have two prominent African-American candidates in this Democratic primary, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, two senators. How are they being received in the state? Do you get any sense that maybe behind some of these low poll numbers, there is some enthusiasm there?
There is enthusiasm, and I see that on the ground from the candidates who are attending these events. It's hard to really gauge a campaign's efficacy and their strength just based on the size of a crowd. It gets our attention, certainly, and it gets for a lot of visual journalism and sometimes becomes viral if there's this huge crowd moment. But a small crowd can be just as enthusiastic sometimes if those supporters are genuinely supporting and in the camp of the candidate whom they are there to see. And I see that. Kamala Harris has spent a lot of time in South Carolina. She is one of the candidates who has been coming here in one way or another since October of 2018, not holding official campaign events there, but really introducing herself to the state. She has a very deep, strong ground game here. She's hired, as many of the campaigns have, but she has hired some very smart native South Carolinians who have a lot of experience doing this and who know who to look to and where to go and how to really set up those organizational networks that are crucial in these early states to really get the word out and to get people motivated and excited. Cory Booker has done the same. He has hired a lot of strong people on his campaign and done a lot of organizing down at the grassroots level. He has gotten to know the state. He's come here a lot, not as much lately, but in the first part of the year, right after he officially kicked off his campaign, he was coming through South Carolina very regularly. So yes, when I go to events and, people have on these T-shirts showing which candidates they support, I see a lot of Bernie ones, sure, at these big, cattle call kind of events. But the other two that I would probably say I see the most of are Kamala Harris and Cory Booker. So the supporters that they've both been able to grow here in South Carolina seem very devoted. And the ones that I talked to seem that they've already settled. They're no longer candidate shopping. They found the ones that they want to support in the actual ballot next year.
We're talking to Meg Kinnard, AP's political reporter in South Carolina. She just talked with Joe Biden over the weekend, one of the leading contenders for the Democratic nomination. So one of the candidates who was on Joe Biden's mind, one of his rivals, is Elizabeth Warren. She's definitely nipping at his heels nationally and in those first two states, in Iowa and in New Hampshire. What was Joe Biden saying about Elizabeth Warren, and what's your sense of Elizabeth Warren's strength in South Carolina?
I asked Joe Biden specifically, look, Elizabeth Warren is really starting to get some attention, particularly around here. How does that affect what you're doing? And he said, it doesn't affect it at all.
She doesn't affect my strategy, period. And I'm not being facetious. I think she's a fine person, good candidate.
So at least what he's willing to say
Classic
out loud.
politician line.
Right. What is he going to say? Like, oh, I'm horrified? I just certainly didn't expect that. But, he really is committed outwardly to continuing to be Joe Biden. That's one thing that the campaign has said consistently sells their message the best, is that personal touch that people feel, when they are really getting to know Joe Biden, when they see him up close and personal, they feel like they can make a connection, and that's what resonates. And so they say that he sells their campaign message better than any other sort of political strategy could. So in Joe Biden's mind, he says that he's not worried. He says that he does have a polling cushion over Elizabeth Warren. She has been digging into that a little bit here in South Carolina, as we've seen in some recent numbers, but it's still there. And it's still, I would say, significant enough for him to perhaps not feel like he has South Carolina sewn up. I don't think that that's an attitude that he or his campaign would ever adopt, but at least to feel that he doesn't need to be here every single week right now.
Meg, you also asked Biden really what is, I think, the big question looming over his candidacy, which is age. He would be the oldest person elected president. And there has been this undercurrent of chatter in the political class about maybe he should do a one-term pledge. Maybe he should say, I'm a bridge candidate. Elect me for one term and then I'll hand off to the next generation. Joe Biden says, what about that?
Joe Biden says that he is not going to commit to that.
Would you consider a one-term pledge?
No. Now, it doesn't mean I would run a second term. I'm not going to make that judgment. I'm not going to make that judgment at this moment.
Which, again, what would we expect him
I'm
to
shocked.
say? Like, oh,
I'm
yeah,
shocked.
I'll be a lame duck right out the gate. One of the things that I heard from people earliest in the Joe Biden campaign, when it became official earlier this year, was that they did see him as potentially somebody who could be that knowledgeable bridge between what they hoped would be the end of a Trump presidency and then perhaps lead to a younger, more progressive candidate that maybe couldn't be elected in 2020, but perhaps after the mollification of a one Biden term could be elected in 2024. So certainly that is something that at least some voters are thinking about. I've heard a lot of theories of, well, maybe he should go ahead and announce who his VP pick is going to be right now, so we can just get excited about that ticket if it's got some youth, if it's got some diversity, whatever it is. Of course, he, as we would expect, says it's far too early to talk about that and that he hasn't even been nominated yet, but he certainly wouldn't be in the mindset of turning anyone down necessarily in terms of putting together a diverse ticket. But Joe Biden says he's in good health. He says that he's, as he has maintained, he's going to release his medical records before any votes are cast. So at least in terms of talking to him himself, it sounds like he feels pretty good.
Between the two of us, Meg, we know a lot of politicians, and I'm pretty sure we probably couldn't find many who would make themselves a lame duck right off the bat. But no. Hey, we got to ask, right?
That's what we're here for. That's right. That's right.
Meg Kinnard, AP's political reporter in South Carolina. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
That's it for this week's Ground Game from the Associated Press. We'll be here every Wednesday for the latest political news from the Beltway and beyond. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.